Welcome to a workshop on how to do research and get published. Thank you for joining our presentation today. Today we'll be focusing on what it takes to get published in an academic journal, specifically all about copyright permissions and author reuse. So welcome. Today we'll be joined by three people. The first is V. LaBianca, who has over a decade of editorial and publishing operations experience and received their master's degree in publishing from Portland State University. They are currently a publishing journal on the Sage U.S. Journal's editorial team, focusing on humanities and social sciences. Randolph J. Nudo, PhD, is a university distinguished professor and vice chair of research in the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine at the University of Kansas Medical Center in Kansas City, Kansas. He serves as associate director at the Landon Center of Aging and director of the Institute for Neurological Discoveries. Dr. Nudo is the editor-in-chief of Neurorehabilitation and Neural Repair, a leading journal in the field of rehabilitation, and deputy editor of Brain Stimulation. He is a leading authority of neuroplasticity and recovering after brain injuries. And last, I'm Sean Scarsbrick, a marketing manager on the author marketing team at Sage. My primary role is to provide support to authors and reviewers as they move through the publishing process, with a particular focus on providing targeted resources to provide support at the appropriate time in the publication process. I have a BA in history and an MA in history from Manhattan and Hunter College, respectively, and I'm based out of New York. So today, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them via the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll do the best to answer as many questions as we can, but time constraints may not allow us to answer all of them, so we will follow up with those questions we haven't had a chance to address after the webinar. We ask that as you look through the Q&A function, if you see a particular question that you think is really important for us to answer, please do like it. We're able to filter by the most number of likes at the end, and we'll start with those. So to get us situated today, I wanted to illustrate a timeline of the typical author journey, moving from the early stages of securing funding and conducting review, all the way through to peer review and publication. So as you know, today we'll talk about copyright permissions and author reuse. And we encourage you to go back to watch recordings of the other topics we've covered in the series, including how to write a manuscript and more information about image integrity. So let's start with a basic overview of what exactly copyright entails. I wanted to first clarify and emphasize that the information included is not meant as legal advice, and that it's always a good idea to seek advice on any unclear use related to copyright or similar areas with the author's institution or other source regarding the author's specific planned use. So for today's session, all material published by Sage Publishing are subject to applicable copyright laws. We're going to be mainly focusing on copyright laws of the United States and the United Kingdom, where Sage's primary publishing offices are located, but many of these principles can be applied globally. In submitting a manuscript to a Sage journal, an author represents that all included materials are the author's own work unless clearly identified as otherwise. To avoid any potential issues with plagiarism, such as representing someone else's work or their ideas as your own, or copyright infringement, such as violating the exclusive copyright rights of an author, or any other violation of the rights of other parties. And this can include, but is not limited to, personal rights, an expectation of privacy, or other confidentiality requirements. Authors should clearly identify any third-party material and their respective rights holders in their submissions. The author shall additionally ensure that any needed permissions are secured and provided to the journal with their accepted article. And whenever you're in doubt, please contact the journal's editor or production editor for additional clarification. So if you have written your contribution yourself or with co-authors, or you have been commissioned to write the article by someone else, such as a government agency or an employer or any other party, you and your co-authors will hold the copyright in your article. If you have written the contribution in the capacity of your role at work or your contract of employment, you may not hold the copyright in your contribution, and you will need to check the relevant box on your contributor agreement. It's worth spending a little time talking about how the subscription and open access, also called OA models, are the same and how they differ, because this is one of the most important issues in the industry right now, and it has been for several years now. It also relates to copyright and possible potential situations of reuse in which you may need to request permission. So in all cases, an author writes, then submits the content to us, and if accepted, the article is published and then made available to readers. In the subscription model, readers pay for access. The publisher's job is to publish interesting content for our customers, the readers. The content is kept behind a paywall. So this is to access it. A reader must have a subscription either through their institution or as an individual. Some journals print magazines or mail them out, print issues similar to magazines, while others are online only. The subscription model has been around for as long as academic journals have been, for over 100 years. In the open access model, authors pay with us to publish. Frequently, they have financial support from their institution or their funders. A publisher's job is to publish what's valid with some caveats, and authors are our customers. The content is then freely available online for anyone to read. No logins or subscriptions are required. Most open access journals are online only and may have eliminated issues entirely. Open access works very well on the internet, but it didn't work very well pre-internet. It is relatively new and only started gaining traction in 2008. This impacts copyright and the contributor form you are signing.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Before I take over a little bit, just a warning, my cat is suffering from seasonal allergies. And so if you hear some sneezing off screen left, that's what's happening. All right, so let's talk a little bit about publishing options. So if an author opts for open access, there are 3 different OA publishing routes that exist for Sage authors. Gold OA means that an author's paper is included within one of Sage's pure gold OA journals. The Sage Choice option allows you to publish an OA article in any of our hybrid journals, which include OA articles within subscription journals. Green OA enables you to share or deposit the original submission or accepted manuscript at any time after your article is accepted for publication at Sage. The first 2 allow you to publish with a CC license, and we'll get more into CC licenses in a minute. Authors have the option to publish with Sage either in a fully open access journal or open access in a traditional subscription-based journal, which is known as hybrid, or at Sage, Sage Choice. Authors pay an article processing charge or an APC. The standard rate for a Sage Choice in a traditional journal is $3,000, but you may be eligible for discounts or waivers through your institution. Publishing open access allows you to publish your article under a Creative Commons license or a CC license. This allows the research to be freely accessible and available to all readers, and even allows others to reuse content again. So let's dive into Creative Commons licenses a little bit more deeply. Open access articles are published under one of several Creative Commons licenses, ensuring authors retain copyright of their work while allowing others to copy, distribute, and reuse with adequate citation. So Sage's default license option is CC BY-NC, which prevents others from using work for commercial purposes. Other CC licenses can be mandated by funders, journals, or open access agreements. The Sage Open Access portal presents authors the choice of license options specified by these requirements. So let's dive into these options real fast. So a CC BY requires that content may be copied, adapted, displayed, distributed, republished, or otherwise reused for any purpose, including adaptation and commercial use, provided the content is attributed. For CC BY-NC, this is the same, but provided the purpose of these activities is not for commercial use. Commercial use, and we'll get more deep into that in a bit, means that the use of content by a commercial organization or individual for direct or indirect commercial gain or remuneration. So they can use your article, but they can't be compensated for that. CC BY-ND is the same as CC BY again, but this provides that reuse is not an adaptation or derivative, and the integrity of the original work is maintained. To create an adaptation, translation, or derivative of the original work, further permission is required from the publisher. CC BY-NC-ND, we're getting into the mouthful here, combines the same restrictions of CC BY-NC and CC BY-ND. So it is available for reuse with attribution as long as it is not a derivative and does not result in financial compensation or remuneration. And the other one occasionally used at Sage is CC BY-IGO, which conveys all of the reuse rights as a CC BY license, but used by intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the World Health Organization. The reason that these are different from the corresponding CC licenses is that they contain two unique provisions. The first is that disputes will be resolved by mediation, or if mediation fails, through arbitration. The second is that the license allows for what's called a cure period, so that if a license corrects a license violation within 30 days of its discovery, the license will automatically reinstate. And then finally, CC BY-SA. SA stands for share alike. So if you remix, transform, or build upon the material, you must distribute your contributions under the same license as the original. This is basically the golden rule of publishing. So how may an author use materials published under a Creative Commons license? If you're interested in reusing material published under a CC license, you should first determine the type of license that applies to the material. The Creative Commons licenses cover several rights arrangements where an article or other content is published with certain rights extended to the general public. The name of the Creative Commons license provides a quick reference of the restrictions that apply to that content. For example, the CC BY, also known as the Creative Commons Attributions License, only requires users include attribution to the original work and its author. There are no other restrictions on the work. The Creative Commons Non-Commercial License includes additional restriction that any later use of the content must be for non-commercial purposes only. Let's get into a couple of examples of what commercial reuse means. Examples of commercial reuse might include republication of content in a work or product available for sale, unless subject to other copyright exceptions such as fair use or fair dealing, and we will discuss that in a minute. Republication of content in presentations, brochures, or other marketing materials by a commercial entity or by any entity for commercial purposes. Distribution of the content to promote or market a person, product, course, service, or organization. Text and data mining for the purpose of creating a saleable product or a product which benefits from promotional or advertising revenue. Use of content by a commercial entity or individual for the purposes of remuneration, directly or indirectly through sale, licensing, promotion, or advertising. And authors of published papers with a non-commercial or NC or no derivatives and D specification, who may also reuse their work as stated under the Green Open Access Policy in the guidelines for Sage authors. And those guidelines are available online. So say you want to reuse material from another source in your article. What do you do? If your contribution includes third-party material for which you do not have the copyright, you are responsible for clearing all needed permissions for such material and identifying the source within your article. You may be able to use the material without permission if your use meets the requirements of fair use in the US, fair dealing in the UK, the STM permissions guidelines, and we'll get to that, or certain types of licenses, which we will go into further. If none of these apply, you will be responsible for submitting written permission agreements from the copyright owner of the material and paying any directed related permission fees. In most cases, the publisher of the original work is going to be the best contact for securing permission. If your contribution does not qualify for the exceptions mentioned above, you will need to clear permission for all third-party material you intend to include within your article. Direct text extracts, tables, or illustrations that have appeared in copyrighted material must be accompanied by written permission for their use from the copyright owner, along with complete information as to the source. You will also want to be mindful of any images that identify people. In addition to securing permission for photographs that portray identifiable persons, these photos should also be accompanied by signed releases from these people, providing their informed consent for the publication of their photo. This is particularly important for children and also essential if photographs feature situations where privacy would be expected. So we mentioned STM permission guidelines in the previous slide. So what are those? How can you use them as an author? So SAGE is a signatory of the STM permissions guidelines. Despite their name, the STM permissions guidelines are not limited to the use of scientific, technical, and medical content. Instead, all publications, unless specifically excluded by the publishers who are signatories to the guidelines, are eligible for use under the terms. So if you were to publish in a social science journal, the STM permissions guidelines would still apply. The STM permissions guidelines webpage includes the list of signatory publishers, excluded works, whether the publisher has opted out of receiving notice, and a description of the allowed use under the guidelines. So it is going to be your one-stop shop to see if the publisher that you are either requesting permission from or publishing with is a signatory. The guidelines allow signatory publishers and their authors to use small amounts of other signatory publishers' materials without payment of a fee. In some cases, where the publisher has opted out of receiving notice, like SAGE has, there is no need to request permission. Where the signatory has not opted out, the author should simply cite the guidelines when requesting the material from the publisher. And then if you're requesting permission online through an online portal, STM publisher may be an option for user type when identifying the journal in which your article will be published. Reuse under the STM permission guidelines will not incur a fee. All right, so let's talk a little bit about fair dealing and fair use. And as Sean said before, we're going to be talking about both because we do have primary publishing locations in both the US and the UK. But it is worth checking with your organization or your country of business as well to make sure that you are in applicable laws for all parties. So what is fair dealing and what does it cover? The UK Copyright Designs and Patents Act of 1988 provides that copyright will not be infringed by, quote, fair dealing, but does not define what fair dealing itself means. It has come to be interpreted as referring to the way material is used, as well as the intention of the person using it. However, use of third-party material must qualify as fair dealing for a particular purpose. There are a number of these purposes specified in UK law, but the most relevant one for us is fair dealing for criticism or review. So what constitutes fair dealing for criticism or review? The use of third-party material must be, quote, fair. That means not systematic and not conflicting with the rights of the copyright holder or affecting their ability to benefit from the work. There is no set amount of material allowed or forbidden. However, the use cannot be systematic or excessive. Do not rely on word counts. And you must always make proper acknowledgements to the original copyright work. So the criticism or review piece, what does that entail? The third-party material must be discussed in the context of criticism or review. This is an essential component, providing a justification for fair dealing. Only work that has been previously published or otherwise made available to the public may be used. There is no legal definition of criticism or review, but it's likely there would be a fairly liberal interpretation by the courts. Mere illustration or window dressing is ruled out. A good question to ask is whether your work would stand up if the material was deleted. If so, it is unlikely to be for criticism and review. Permission is always required if you wish to modify or make changes to the third-party material because all authors have moral rights under European law. If you are in doubt as to whether or not you can use the material for fair dealing, you should clear permission or leave the material out. Please note that this is SAGE's working view of a relatively untested area of the law. So we are not legal experts in this sense. We just want to make sure that you have all the information. All right, and then fair use, what is its cover? So this is the US version. Similar to fair dealing in the UK, fair use is codified as Section 107 of the US Copyright Act and provides an exception to the exclusive rights of copyright holder under certain limited circumstances. Fair use involves a 4-factor analysis that includes the following: the purpose and nature of the use, the nature of the original material, the amount of the original material being used in relation to the original work as a whole, and the effect the use will have on the market of the original work. Text, photographs, illustrations, and figures are all subject to fair use, but generally the more creative the original work, the nature of the original work, the weaker the basis for a fair use argument. Where the latter use is transformative, that is, where the purpose of the use is different from the purpose of the original creation, the fair use argument will be stronger. Only the minimal portion of the original work that is sufficient for the use should be used. For example, where a 200-word excerpt is adequate for the use, no more than 200 words should be reproduced. Photographs should be reproduced in the minimum size that will achieve the purpose. Reproduction of an excerpt for the purposes of commentary, criticism, and discussion may be the basis for a fair use argument, subject to the overall determination under the four-factor analysis. And again, if you are in any doubt as to whether or not you can use the material under fair use, you should clear permission or leave the material out. Let's talk a little bit about public domain, which is different than fair dealing and fair use. How can you tell whether content is available under public domain? Public domain refers to content that otherwise meets the eligibility for being copyrightable, but where no legal copyright exists. This can occur in the following scenarios. The copyright has expired, or the work was created by an employee of the US federal government as part of the official duties of that employee, or as a more recent and less common development, the author of the work has disclaimed all copyright rights in their work and has purposefully placed their work in the public domain. If you are a nerd like me, you may have experienced the excitement that was, I believe, this last New Year when Sherlock Holmes officially entered the public domain. That was a very big day for a lot of people. So let's dive into each of these three a little bit more. The copyright has expired. To determine whether the work in to determine whether a work is in the public domain under this scenario, for US published works, a good first step is to review the publication date of the work and determine the length of copyright at the time the work was published. For example, works published in the US before 1923 are in the public domain because the work had already passed into the public domain when the 1976 Copyright Act went into effect. The duration of copyright has changed since the 1976 Act went into effect and is currently 70 years after December 31st of the year the author dies. Many works will have a copyright claim well over 100 years. The copyright term for work made for hire works is 95 years. A useful reference for reviewing whether a work is still under copyright is the public domain Sherpa Copyright Calculator. This is not affiliated with Sage, but it can be located online, and we will make sure that you get the link to that. And then for UK published works, copyright generally lasts for the life of the creator plus 70 years, counted from the end of the year in which the creator dies. So very similar. Upon expiration of the copyright, the work enters the public domain and may be used by anyone. Films and sound recordings may have varying durations of copyright depending on when or if they were published and the number of people involved. When talking about the work that is created by an employee of the US federal government as part of the employee's official duties, to determine whether a work is in the public domain, confirm the copyright status of each of the individual authors. If all authors of a work are US government employees who completed their contributions as part of their employment, then the content of the work is in the public domain. If any one of the authors is not a US government employee, then the work as a whole will not be considered public domain. And then finally, what do you do when the work is purposefully placed by its author in the public domain? This is a rare situation and will only be relevant where the author has included a statement in the work stating the author has relinquished copyright rights. If you will be using any material under this scenario, please ensure the materials are clearly attributed to the author and a reference to the author's statement relinquishing copyright is included. Please be aware that a particular version of a public domain article may have a copyright protection based on the formatting or other creative selection and arrangement of the text that was completed by the journal or other publication, in which case the public domain content was published. In this case, the work's content may be published, may be used as public domain material, but a particular formatted version should not be photocopied or further distributed. For example, digital images of 2D public domain works, generally digital images of paintings, may be protected by copyright in the UK. In addition, newer versions or adaptations of a public domain work may have their own copyright. Examples of copyright protective derivative works based on public domain materials include, for example, a new recording of a work by Mozart or a film version of a Shakespeare play. And then just a couple of examples, forms that you might want to consider filling out if you do have questions or want to obtain copyright information or permission. In order to publish your work in the print and online versions of your article, we do at Sage require permission to be granted for worldwide rights to reproduce in all media in all formats. Here's a template for your use. You will get the link to that in the recording as well. And then also best practice, separate from copyright, you will want to include a personal rights release that provides permission to publish someone's visual or audio likeness, should it be secured by the publication. That includes photographs, videos, audio recordings that depict the individual's traits. There are several personal and privacy rights, which are governed under state law in the US and general data protection regulation in the UK and other European countries, and other national privacy laws. But the main rights that come into question with photographs and video clips provided for journal articles are as follows. One, expectation of privacy where the subject is recognizable, either because their face is showing or another distinctive feature, such as a highly unique tattoo. And the subject has an expectation of privacy when the photograph was taken of them. Two, right of endorsement, approval of any of use of someone's likeness to endorse or promote a commercial product. And three, false light, which refers to a prohibition under several state laws in the US. False light occurs when a photo is used in a manner that wrongfully suggests something about the subject of the photo and could be part of a defamation claim. If you want to use a photo depicting an individual in your article, you should ensure you have permission from the individual depicted in the photo unless an exception applies. Be aware that photos of children under 18 and all medical or health information are particularly sensitive and should always be cleared with a written release. If an individual is identifiable in any audio and or visual media included in your contribution, you may use Sage's template release form to request permission. I'll hand it off to Randy.
Thank you, V. And this is a point where we look at some topics that are important when you're submitting manuscripts to a journal. I, as an editor, will get involved at this point. So let's recap who can claim authorship and what that entails. And this will directly impact the copyright line and how you handle the journal contributor agreement you'll sign upon publication. Now, authorship confers credit and has important academic, social, and financial implications. Authorship also implies responsibility and accountability for published work. And it's important to understand who counts as an author. Anyone has a legitimate claim to authorship if they have done all of the following: made a substantial contribution to the concept or design of the work, or to the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data, drafted the article or revised it critically to include important intellectual content, agreed with and approved the version to be published, and agreed to be accountable for all aspects of the work by ensuring that questions related to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. These criteria apply to all article types. When there is no acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data for the work, for example, for an editorial, the first criterion, the substantial contribution to design or concept of the work, may be met. That may meet the criteria. There's a large multi-center group that has conducted the work. This often happens with large multi-site clinical trials, for example. The group should identify the individuals willing to accept direct responsibility for the manuscript. These individuals should fully meet the criteria for authorship. When submitting a manuscript authored by a group, the corresponding author should specify the group name if one exists and clearly identify the group members who can take credit for and responsibility for the work as authors. The byline of the article identifies who is directly responsible for the manuscript, and Medline lists as authors whichever names appear on the byline. If the byline includes a group name, Medline will list the names of individual group members who are authors or who are collaborators, sometimes called non-author contributors. If there is a note associated with the byline clearly stating that the individual names are elsewhere in the paper and whether those names are authors or collaborators. For authors submitting to social science or humanities journals, all parties who have made a substantive contribution to the article should be listed as authors. Principal authorship, authorship order, other publication credits should be based on the relative scientific or professional contributions of the individuals involved, regardless of their status. A student is usually listed as principal author on any multiple author publication that substantially derives from the student's dissertation or theses. Additionally, best practice is that authors get permission from anyone they plan to list in the acknowledgments to ensure the person does not object. Being listed implies knowledge and endorsement of the article, so anyone named should provide their consent for this. And so, all of this is surrounds the general topic of transparency. So, so we can move now to resources to determine authorship. And many journals base their criteria on this ICMJE, that's the International Committee on for Medical Journal Editors. And we can give you links to that site and the others as well. But some styles like APA, the American Psychological Association, have guidance on this as well. We recommend using forms to help guide authorship decisions. Forms such as those linked at the APA site will give you those links, or the contributor roles taxonomy credit. And this is being used more and more. In fact, the journal that I edit, we're just implementing a formal taxonomy for contributor roles that will require authors to list each author and their contributions. That's especially helpful for large teams and projects. The COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, also has a page of resources offering guidance on authorship, and we'll also provide that link and with regard to publication ethics. Journals, especially in the humanities and social sciences, follow different guidance. I will say that as an editor, I refer to ICMJE and COPE guidelines constantly in making decisions about the ethics of a particular topic. So those of you, especially who are in the medical field, I would recommend that you become familiar with the guidelines listed there. And with regard to ethics and responsibility, again, I can't emphasize the word transparency enough. As an author, you should ensure that your work is original and written by you. Your work has not been previously published and has been submitted only to the journal. Submitted work should not have been published elsewhere in any form or language, partially or in full, unless the new work concerns an expansion of previous work. A single study should not be split up into several parts just to increase the quantity of submissions. Sometimes that's appropriate to have multiple articles from a single study, but not for the sole purpose of increasing the quantity of submissions and submitted to various publications or to one publication over time. Sometimes we used to call that salami slicing. Concurrent or secondary publication is sometimes justifiable, provided certain conditions are met. For example, translations or a manuscript that is intended for a different group of readers. You should also ensure that where the material is taken from other sources, including your own published writing, the source is clearly cited and that where appropriate, permission is obtained. And please provide transparency on the reuse of material to avoid the concerns about text recycling or self-plagiarism. You should ensure that your work does not infringe on any rights of others, including privacy rights and intellectual property rights. You should ensure your data is true and not manipulated. Results should be presented clearly, honestly, without fabrication, falsification, or inappropriate data manipulation, including image-based manipulation. The research being reported should have been conducted in an ethical and responsible manner, should comply with all relevant legislation. You should ensure that your data is your own, or you have permission to use data reproduced in your paper. Upon request, authors should be prepared to send relevant documentation or data in order to verify the validity of the results presented. This could be in the form of raw data, samples, records, or other things. Sensitive information in the form of confidential or proprietary data is excluded from this. You should ensure that any real or apparent conflicting or competing interest is clearly stated on submission of the paper. This would include funding assistance. As the International Committee on Medical Journal Editors emphasizes, individuals may disagree on whether an author's relationships or activities represent conflicts, although the presence of a relationship or activity does not always indicate a problematic influence on a paper's content. Perceptions of content may erode, perceptions of conflict may erode trust in science as much as actual conflicts of interest. Ultimately, readers must be able to make their own judgments regarding whether an author's relationships and activities are pertinent to a paper's content. These judgments require transparent disclosures. An author's complete disclosure demonstrates a commitment to transparency and helps to maintain trust in the scientific process. Should ensure that authors adhere to all research ethics guidelines of their discipline, particularly where human or animal subjects are involved. Appropriate approval, licensing, or registration should be obtained before the research begins, and details should be provided in the report. We have previous webinars specifically on this topic. The author should ensure that authorship of the paper is accurately represented, including ensuring that all individuals credited as authors participated in the actual authorship of the work, and that all who participated are credited and have given consent for publication. Should ensure that all authors have given permission for the submission and that everyone who contributed is appropriately credited. No one is left out. Above all, authors should be transparent. For example, if an author is not sure whether her paper is original, for instance, whether it might constitute duplicate publication, she should inform the journal's editor. The editor decides it is appropriate to publish the paper itself, should state clearly any potential overlap. Study limitations should be addressed. An author should inform a journal if the work submitted to the journal has been posted on a preprint server, and something that is much more common these days, especially in the biomedical field, and provide a link to the preprint, whether the posting occurs prior to submission or during the peer review process. It's also helpful to indicate in the text of the manuscript, perhaps in the introduction, that a preprint is available and how reviewers can access that preprint. In addition, it's the author's and not the journal editor's responsibility to ensure that preprints are amended to point readers to subsequent versions of the work, including the published article. As a reminder, please be sure to read the author submission guidelines for the specific journal in which you want to submit to, and see the list of ethics guidelines the journal expects authors to comply with. Author disclosures can include something like no conflict of interest exists in the submission of the manuscript, or for funding. This could be as simple as the study was funded by X foundation, for example, of the University of Y. The article is available in the preprint server and the link is blank. Those are examples of how you can disclose various things. Many journals will require that you have ethical statements and approvals, such as approval to conduct the study was obtained from the Institutional Review Board of X University. And with regard to prior publication, SAGE follows the COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics guidelines, in addressing potential redundant publications. And as editors, we deal with this periodically. and to avoid the need for corrective action after publication. This is something that nobody wants to retract a paper, and that's a last resort unless in the case where redundant publication is obvious. And to avoid that kind of corrective action, please disclose any prior publication or distribution of your manuscript to the editor when you're submitting your manuscript to the journal. It's important to ensure appropriate attribution to your prior publication of the material is included in the manuscript, and any quoted materials are identified as quotes so that readers of your article may reference the original work. If a substantial portion of the manuscript has been previously published, your manuscript will generally not be acceptable for publication in a Sage journal. However, subject to each journal's policies, there are certain circumstances where material that has been publicly distributed may be considered for publication. You should first review the instructions to authors for the journal you're interested in submitting to, and you can find that on the journal's website. And to review that journal's policy, should also include a description of any prior distribution of any part of your manuscript when submitting your manuscript to the journal and within the manuscript itself. There's some examples of prior distribution that may be acceptable. Working papers or versions of papers posted on a preprint server or a scholarly collection network, sometimes called an SCN. Consult the journal's submission guidelines to determine whether the journal will consider submissions that have been previously shared as a preprint. While Sage generally supports the early dissemination of research through preprints, the pre-peer review version of the paper, also referenced as the working paper, including through Sage's own preprint platform, Advance, and other preprint platforms and SCNs such as BioArchive and other preprint servers. ResearchGate, academia.edu. Some journals will not consider submissions that have been shared as preprint prior to submission. So make sure that you look at the journal's guidelines for preprints. Most dissertation and theses posted in institutional archives are fine to submit. Excerpts or material from your dissertation have not been through peer review will generally be eligible. However, if the excerpt from the dissertation included in your manuscript is the same or substantially the same as any previously published work, the editor may determine it's not suitable for publication in the journal. Conference abstracts, posters, and presentations are often acceptable. Subject to the journal's policy, manuscripts based on papers that have been presented at conferences may be considered for publication as long as they have not been published and provided you still retain the rights to the manuscript. The journal editor may review whether the version of your article considered for publication is materially different from the work you presented at a conference, and or whether the publication in the journal will enable your article to reach an audience that the conference paper did not previously reach. Prior publication of an abstract or poster presented at a conference will generally not impact the manuscript's eligibility for publication. And again, those should be, even those abstracts or posters presented at conferences should be disclosed. Raw data and clinical trials registry. New papers based on data that have been previously referenced in other works may be acceptable. However, please note that permission may be required to reuse collections of data, and any prior works by you based on the same data collection as that used in the manuscript should be identified by you when submitting the manuscript to the journal. If you're reproducing data that was arranged, organized, or compiled by someone else, such as in a table or appendix, you should check whether permission is needed to reproduce the table, appendix, or other collection of data within your manuscript. Keep in mind that some journals use a double anonymized peer review process, and that by posting your article on a preprint server or on a scholarly collaboration network, such as ResearchGate, your article and its author list may be discovered by reviewers. This will not prevent most journals from considering your article, but please make sure you're comfortable with reviewers possibly discovering your identity before posting your preprint online. To understand the different types of peer review models, we recommend you look at COPE's ethical guidelines for peer reviews, and we can send you links again to COPE. If you have any questions about whether or not posting a preprint may jeopardize your submission to a journal, you should contact the journal editor. After submission to a SAGE journal, you're asked to refrain from posting updated versions of your paper until a publication decision is made. Upon acceptance of your paper to a SAGE journal, you may post your article in accordance with the terms applicable to the journal as stated in the guidelines for SAGE authors. The final published version of your article, the formatted PDF, should not be used when posting a paper on any open, unrestricted website, including preprint servers, your own website, subject repositories, or any other scholarly collaboration networks or article sharing networks such as ResearchGate, Mendeley, or academia.edu, unless a license allowing such posting is in place. And any of you who have had to post your articles to PubMed and to attribute your article, for example, to an NIH grant, have probably become familiar with this, because you specifically are not allowed to submit the formatted PDF, and you must submit the version that was last reviewed and approved for acceptance to the journal. And with that, I'll turn it back to V.
Wonderful. Thank you, Randy. So congratulations, your paper has been accepted. Yay, the work's done, right? Not really, sorry. There's still a couple of things that you will need to keep in mind as you move through the paper acceptance process. And the first thing that I want to draw your attention to here is the journal contributor publishing agreement. So let's go over this a little bit. Once your manuscript has been accepted, SAGE requires the author as the rights holder to sign a journal contributor's publishing agreement for all articles we publish. SAGE's journal contributor's publishing agreement is a license agreement under which the author retains copyright in the work, but grants SAGE the sole and exclusive right and license to publish for the full legal term of the copyright. Exceptions may exist where assignment of copyright is required or preferred by a proprietor other than SAGE. In this case, copyright in the work will be assigned from the author to the society. With an exclusive license, you retain copyright. Your contribution is credited as C, the authors, but you license the control of all rights exclusively to SAGE, or where relevant, a society or other proprietary publishing partner. This means that all licensing requests, including permissions, are managed by SAGE. Why do we use an exclusive license? We want to bring your contribution to the widest possible readership. An exclusive license helps us ensure adequate protection against infringement of copyright protected material through breach of copyright or piracy anywhere in the world. It also ensures that requests by third parties to reprint or reproduce a contribution or part of it in any format are handled efficiently in accordance with general policy, which encourages dissemination of knowledge inside the framework of copyright. So, for example, if somebody wanted to use an excerpt of your published article through SAGE, we handle that permissions process for you in order to make sure that the researcher looking for that permission gets a timely response. You may sign and return your contributor agreement in the following ways. Most SAGE journals have instituted an online submission and review system known as SAGE Track. This system will allow you to agree to the terms and conditions of journal publishing contributors agreements online and will automate the return of your contributor agreement. You can also submit a scanned hard copy of the agreement with your signature on it, or a digital original copy with your electronic signature. These are equally acceptable. On a case-by-case basis, if needed, you can mail it in or fax a traditional hard copy. You must ensure that you have your co-author's consent to submit the article for publication, and that you have the right to sign the contributor agreement on their behalf. If they prefer, all authors may sign the agreement as well. Co-authors may either all sign and return the same copy of the agreement, or each author may sign and return separate copies of the agreement, whichever works best. To indicate that the rights to your work are owned by your employer, You may check the relevant box on your contributor agreement and also have an authorized representative of your employer sign the contributor agreement before returning it. If you are a UK, Canadian, Australian, or British Commonwealth government employee, you just need to check the regular work made for hire for employment box or other government work, not US, as applicable to your agreement, and have your manager sign the contributor agreement too. If you are a US federal employee, please check with your manager, but your work is likely in the public domain and not in copyright and therefore not assignable. Please check the relevant box on the form. If you are required to submit an addendum by your employer or research funding body, please make sure your request via email or provide a copy of the addendum to the production editor in the US, including the name of the journal, the title of your paper, and the details of the request. You may share the original submission or accepted manuscript at any time in any format, and this constitutes author reuse. You may use the final published PDF or original submission or accepted manuscript if preferred in the following ways. In relation to your own teaching, provided that any electronic distribution maintains restricted access. To share on an individual basis with research colleagues, provided that such sharing is not for commercial purposes. In your dissertation or thesis, including where the dissertation or thesis will be posted in any electronic institutional repository or database, and in a book authored or edited by you at any time after the contribution's publication in the journal. So some examples here. If you want to provide your article to students and you are teaching them, you can provide them that as long as they then pay the subscription fee for the journal access. You can also, for example, use it in a dissertation or in a book, as long as that book is published after your contribution has been published. And then let's just dive very quickly into a little bit more about open access articles and the differences here. Open access content is made freely available under the terms of a Creative Commons license. Open access publication is usually subject to payment of an article processing charge, as we talked about, the APC, paid by the author, institution, or funding body. At Sage, open access publication is available through 3 routes: Gold open access journals, hybrid open access or Sage Choice, and green open access archiving. Gold open access journals publish all of their content open access under a Creative Commons license, and most gold open access journals charge an article processing charge payable by the author, institution, or funding body. Most journals are members of the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, and each journal's peer review policy is outlined in the journal's manuscript submission guidelines, which can be found on the individual journal's website on Sage Journals. So if you ever have a question specific to an individual journal, please do check the submission guidelines page. Creative Commons licenses allow authors to retain copyright of their work while allowing others to copy, distribute, and make some uses of their work. The most common is the Creative Commons Attribution, as we talked about, CC BY, and the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial, CC BY-NC licenses. The funder may require that you choose a particular license, so always make sure you check. And then finally, it is important to note that without a CC license or similar, an article is not considered open access, just free to read. The distinction between free to read and true OA is the ability to freely reuse the content. While different versions of the CC license has various restrictions, such as restricting commercial use, their purpose is to allow authors and others to reuse, repost, and distribute the research content. So if you wanted to make an article published through a subscription-based model available for other people to read without paying a subscription fee, that would be free to read. It would not make that article OA. And then finally, I am going to hand you back over to Sean, but I want to leave you with a little mantra to repeat to yourself after you leave this webinar. When in doubt, clear permission or leave the material out. And I'm going to ask you to say it with me in the privacy of your own home right now. When in doubt, clear permission or leave the material out. And with that, I'll hand you over to Sean.
Thank you, V. So we just have a couple minutes left now, so I want to wrap up a little bit about the webinar series. So thank you, first of all, for joining us today for our webinar. So the How to Do Research and Get Published webinar series happens monthly. And there's a new iteration happening next month on November 15th, all about literature reviews. So if you have any interest on learning more about how best to write and edit and create a literature review, please do check that out. And our December 6th program, we will have how to create a research agenda and develop your personal academic brand. And as always, feel free to check out our main landing page for the How to Do Research and Get Published series, where you're able to watch recordings of previous iterations and also sign up for anything forthcoming. In the coming months, we will be announcing all of our webinars for next year, so do keep an eye out for that as well. So should you have any questions or need support along your work as a journal author, the Sage Author Gateway is Sage's dedicated space for support and services. Visit the website for more resources, more tips and tricks while writing, more support through the publication process, and help in publicizing your article after publication. Information about our author rights and reuse policy is easily discoverable for reference. And last but not least, we also have a Chinese Author Gateway that features translated materials on these topics. Sage takes this role as a partner to authors in the publishing process very seriously, and we hope that this workshop has been helpful. But if you need additional guidance or a refresher, we have many resources on our website. The Sage Campus platform offers a course on how to get published. We have a great 3-part video series with some great tips and tricks that we've covered today. Plus, we have a handy PDF guide that you can reference and easily share with your colleagues. So with that, I'd like to close out our presentation for today. We have time for just one question, so I will quickly jump right into that. So let me stop sharing my screen and pull up my question. So V and Randy, I'm wondering if you have any guidance on how best to deal with copyrights when it comes to dissertations. So for example, how should a researcher go about publishing their work? This is probably in a revised format after it was previously published, potentially published on a platform like ProQuest.
Yeah, I'll start and let B maybe speak a little bit about ProQuest in particular. But generally, when you write a dissertation, this is your original work, and you have spent years and years collecting data and processing it and writing a formal dissertation, which you will defend. And at various times, you submit one or more papers that cover the thesis topic. So generally, the guidelines are fairly liberal when you're submitting to publishers and to specific journals. And so there should not be any problems, but there may be specific guidelines that your university has with regard to the copyright regulations regarding dissertations. And also through ProQuest. So you should always check and double check those sources, maybe even before you get started with your dissertation, to understand any implications that those have. V, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I'm just going to reiterate that while you will always want to check both the submission guidelines page and also ideally with the journal editor themselves, you should be able to use information and papers that have been published as dissertations. And also in terms of submitting those dissertations to repositories or databases like ProQuest, the only thing you'll want to keep in mind there really is if there is a kind of double-blind peer review process, your information and your name may be attached to the article if your peer reviewers are looking up information. So just make sure you're also okay with that. But if you do have any other specific questions about specific journals and what their policies are, always reach out to the journal editor.
Thank you, V and Randy. And thank you very much for joining us today. I want to thank everybody for joining us for the webinar. Just to let you all know that we'll be following up with later this week with the certificate of attendance, with the slides, with the recording. So please do be on the lookout for that. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next month. Take care.